In the darkest moments of her life, an 18-year-old girl faced the unthinkable. Maria was condemned to the electric chair, accused of a crime so heinous that the world seemed eager to see her punished. Public outrage had sealed her fate, and the courtroom echoed with cries for justice. Yet, as she prepared for her final moments, Maria's unwavering faith in God would reveal a greater truth. One that would not only save her life, but also expose a web of deceit and corruption. Keep watching till the end so you don't miss anything. Let's begin. The room was silent, save for the hum of the overhead lights and the faint rustle of fabric as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The air was heavy with tension, thick and almost suffocating, as though it carried the weight of every pair of eyes locked on the figure at the center of the room. Maria, barely 18 years old, sat rigid in the wooden chair, her wrists and ankles strapped down with leather restraints that seemed oversized against her slender frame. Her face, though pale, was serene. Her large dark eyes scanned the room, resting momentarily on each figure before moving to the next. Guards, the warden, journalists scribbling furiously in their notepads. And a small crowd gathered behind the glass, faces pressed close for a better view of the unfolding tragedy. The electric chair loomed around her, a grim symbol of finality. Its crude metal frame glinted dully under the sterile lights, wires trailing down to a switch that would end her young life. Behind the switch stood the executioner, his face obscured by a mask, yet his unease was palpable in the slight tremor of his gloved hands. To his left stood the warden, his expression hard and unreadable, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt as they darted toward Maria. The door at the far end of the room creaked open, and a ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd as Judge Elijah entered, his presence commanding the room like a storm cloud. He was an imposing figure, his robes flowing around him as he strode purposefully to his seat of honor, positioned to have an unobstructed view of Maria. His lips curled into a faint smirk, though his eyes burned with something more sinister, a triumph he made no effort to conceal. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as though settling in for a performance he had orchestrated from the start. Maria's gaze fell on him, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met. There was no hatred in her expression, no fear. Instead, there was a quiet defiance, a steadfastness that seemed to unnerve him. His smirk faltered, and he looked away, pretending to adjust the cuffs of his robe. Maria's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, before closing briefly, as if in prayer. The chaplain stepped forward, his voice trembling, as he recited a prayer for Maria's soul. He spoke of forgiveness, redemption, and the hope of divine mercy, his words echoing hollowly in the stark room. Maria listened silently, her lips moving in unison with his prayers, though her voice was too soft to be heard over his. When he finished, she opened her eyes and looked up, her face illuminated by a faint, almost otherworldly light that seemed to radiate from within her. It was a look of peace, of unshakable faith. "Do you have any final words?" the warden asked, his voice gruff but tinged with an almost imperceptible hesitation. The room fell silent once more, every eye trained on Maria. Even Judge Elijah leaned forward slightly, his smug demeanor momentarily replaced by curiosity. Maria took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling slowly, deliberately, as if she were gathering her thoughts. Her voice, when it came, was soft, yet carried an unmistakable strength that seemed to cut through the oppressive silence. "I am innocent," she began, her words measured and deliberate, "and I forgive those who have wronged me, For God is my witness and my judge. He has seen all. The murmurs began again, louder this time, as her words stirred unease among the crowd. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others exchanged nervous glances. Judge Elijah's face darkened, his jaw tightening as Maria continued. "I know the truth will come to light," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "And when it does, may it be a testament to God's justice and mercy, not the cruelty of man." Her eyes swept the room once more, pausing briefly on the judge, who now sat rigid in his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. "I leave my fate in his hands." For a moment, the room seemed frozen in time. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the journalists had stopped writing, their pens hovering mid-air as they stared at Maria in stunned silence. Then, as if on cue, the hum of the lights grew louder, a mechanical whine signalling the preparation of the chair. The executioner reached for the lever, his movements slow and hesitant. Maria lowered her head, her lips moving once more in silent prayer. The crowd behind the glass pressed closer, their breaths fogging the surface as they watched with morbid fascination. Among them, a young girl clung to her mother's arm, her wide eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "Mama, is she going to heaven?" "Quiet!" the mother hissed, though her own eyes glistened with unshed tears. The warden raised his hand, signalling the executioner to proceed. Maria's final words hung in the air like a prayer, echoing in the minds of everyone present. For some, they were a challenge to their beliefs. For others, they were a chilling reminder of the fragile line between justice and injustice. For Judge Elijah, they were a threat, one that he could not ignore. As the executioner's hand hovered over the lever, Maria's voice rose one last time, clear and unwavering. "The truth will set me free," she declared, her words ringing out like a bell tolling for the innocent. "For God has seen all." The room erupted in chaos. Chairs scraped against the floor as people stood abruptly, shouting and gesturing wildly. The warden barked orders, trying to restore order, but the crowd was already unraveling. Somewhere in the commotion, a journalist shouted, "Stop! Investigate her claims!" But Maria sat quietly amidst the storm, her eyes closed and her face serene, as though she had already been delivered into the hands of a higher power. The story of how Maria ended up in the electric chair began months earlier, in a small, quiet town where whispers travelled faster than the wind and suspicion bred like wildfire. Maria was not a stranger to hardship, but the events that led to her arrest were beyond anything she could have imagined. It began with a tragedy that shook the entire community, the disappearance of Grace, the beloved daughter of Judge Elijah. Grace was 7 years old, a bright-eyed child with golden curls and a laughter that could melt even the coldest hearts. She had been last seen playing outside her home one sunny afternoon, her red dress a blur of motion as she chased a butterfly into the woods. When she failed to return for dinner, the town was thrown into panic. Search parties combed through the woods, dogs sniffed every trail, and helicopters buzzed overhead, their searchlights piercing the darkness. Days turned into weeks, and the hope of finding her alive began to wane. Maria's life intersected with this tragedy in the most devastating way. She worked as a maid for a wealthy family on the outskirts of town, a position she had taken to help support her ailing mother and younger siblings. Quiet and diligent, she was well liked by her employers, but otherwise kept to herself. Her solitary nature, however, would soon become a point of suspicion. The first seed of doubt was planted when a neighbour claimed to have seen Maria near the woods on the day Grace disappeared. It was a flimsy piece of evidence, a fleeting glimpse of a figure in the distance. But in a town desperate for answers, it was enough to ignite a firestorm of accusations. The rumour spread like wildfire. Maria had been near the woods. Maria must have seen something. Maria must have done something. When the police arrived at her modest home, Maria greeted them with a calm that belied the chaos about to unfold. They questioned her about her whereabouts on the day of Grace's disappearance, and she answered honestly. Yes, she had been near the woods walking home from work. No, she hadn't seen Grace or anyone else. Her answers were straightforward, her demeanour unshaken, but the officers exchanged glances that suggested they were not convinced. It wasn't long before the interrogation turned hostile. They asked her why she hadn't come forward sooner, why she hadn't joined the search parties. They questioned her character, her background, even her faith. Maria remained composed, insisting on her innocence, but her protests only seemed to deepen their suspicions. The turning point came when a piece of fabric matching the colour of Grace's dress was discovered near the woods. It was torn and stained with dirt, a chilling clue that seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. The discovery was enough for the police to secure a warrant to search Maria's home, and what they found, or claimed to find, sealed her fate. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room was a small doll, one that Grace's mother identified as her daughter's favourite. Maria's arrest was swift and brutal. The police dragged her from her home in the dead of night, ignoring the cries of her mother and siblings. The press descended on the scene like vultures, their cameras flashing as they captured the image of Maria, handcuffed and stoic, being shoved into the back of a squad car. By morning, her face was plastered across every newspaper, the headlines branding her as a monster. Maid arrested in missing girl case. The town turned against her almost instantly. People who had once greeted her with warm smiles now crossed the street to avoid her family. Her employers dismissed her without so much as a word, her belongings left in a box on their front porch. Strangers gathered outside the police station, shouting for justice and demanding her execution. The idea that Maria could be innocent was not even considered. In the eyes of the public, she was guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt. Maria's trial was a spectacle, a media circus that drew national attention. Judge Elijah presided over the proceedings, his grief-stricken face a constant reminder of the stakes. The prosecution painted a damning picture of Maria as a cunning and cold-hearted criminal. They paraded witnesses who claimed to have seen her acting suspiciously, presented the doll as irrefutable evidence, and even hinted at motives that ranged from jealousy to greed. Maria's defense was weak, hampered by a court-appointed attorney who seemed more interested in ending the trial quickly than in proving her innocence. When Maria took the stand, she spoke simply and honestly, reiterating that she had no knowledge of Grace's disappearance and pleading with the jury to believe her. But her words fell on deaf ears. The prosecution countered with a brutal cross-examination, twisting her statements and painting her as a liar. Throughout the trial, Judge Elijah maintained an air of solemnity, but there were moments when his veneer of impartiality slipped. His gaze lingered on Maria with a hatred that made her shiver. His gavel struck with a force that seemed almost personal. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict, it was no surprise. The sentence was death. The public rejoiced at the news, celebrating Maria's conviction as a victory for justice. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, waving signs and chanting for her execution. For them, Maria was not just guilty. She was the embodiment of evil, a scapegoat onto which they could project their fears and anger. But as Maria sat alone in her cell, the weight of the accusations pressing down on her, she found solace in her faith. She prayed for strength, for clarity, for the truth to come to light. And though the world had condemned her, she held on to the belief that God would not abandon her. The courtroom was packed to capacity, every seat filled with townspeople, reporters, and curious onlookers who had come to witness what many described as the trial of the decade. The air buzzed with tension, a palpable energy that seemed to seep into the walls and floors. At the center of it all sat Maria, flanked by her court-appointed attorney, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was dressed in a plain, ill-fitting dress provided by the prison. A stark contrast to the well-dressed attorneys, officials, and spectators around her. Despite the chaos and hostility in the room, Maria's expression remained calm, her eyes fixed on the wooden table before her, as if she were praying silently. The trial began with opening statements from the prosecution. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man with a voice that carried authority, wasted no time in painting Maria as a calculated and remorseless criminal. He recounted the details of Grace's disappearance, emphasizing the discovery of the doll and the eyewitness testimony that placed Maria near the woods. His words were carefully chosen, designed to stoke the outrage already simmering in the hearts of the jurors and the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he concluded, his voice rising for dramatic effect, "we are not here to speculate. We are here to deliver justice for an innocent child whose life was stolen by the woman sitting before you. The evidence is clear, the motive is evident, and the truth is undeniable." The audience murmured in agreement, heads nodding as though they were already convinced. Maria's attorney, a middle-aged man with a weary demeanor, stood for his opening statement. He spoke softly, almost hesitantly, outlining Maria's insistence on her innocence and urging the jury to consider the possibility that the evidence had been misinterpreted. His words lacked the force and conviction of the prosecutors, and as he sat down, it was clear that his defense had done little to sway the crowd. The prosecution began calling witnesses, starting with Grace's mother. She took the stand, her face pale and her hands trembling as she described the pain of losing her daughter. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she clutched the doll that had been found in Maria's home, her voice breaking as she identified it as Grace's favorite toy. Her testimony was devastating, and when the prosecutor asked her if she believed Maria was responsible, she nodded emphatically. "She took my baby," she whispered, her voice filled with anguish. "She took Grace away from me." Next came the neighbor who claimed to have seen Maria near the woods. Under questioning, he recounted his story in vivid detail, describing a figure he insisted was Maria walking briskly toward the area where Grace had disappeared. When the defense cross-examined him, pointing out inconsistencies in his statement and the possibility that he had mistaken someone else for Maria, the neighbor grew defensive. "I know what I saw," he snapped, glaring at Maria as though daring her to contradict him. The prosecution's case grew stronger with each passing day. Forensic experts testified about the fabric found in the woods, linking it to Grace's dress, and the discovery of the doll was presented as irrefutable proof of Maria's guilt. The prosecution even introduced letters Maria had written to her family, twisting her words to suggest a lack of remorse and an attempt to evade responsibility. Every piece of evidence, no matter how circumstantial, was woven into a narrative that painted Maria as a monster. When it was finally Maria's turn to take the stand, the courtroom fell silent. All eyes were on her as she rose from her seat and walked to the witness stand, her movements slow and deliberate. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. The defense began by asking Maria to describe her life, her work, and her relationship with her family. She spoke softly but clearly, recounting her struggles to support her siblings and her dedication to her faith. When asked about the day Grace disappeared, Maria explained again that she had been walking home from work and had not seen Grace or anyone else in the woods. Her words were simple and heartfelt, but they lacked the drama and intensity that the jury seemed to crave. Then came the cross-examination. The prosecutor wasted no time in attacking Maria's credibility, asking her pointed questions about the doll and why it had been found in her home. Maria maintained her innocence, explaining that she had never seen the doll before it was discovered by the police. "I don't know how it got there," she said, her voice firm. "But I swear to you, I had nothing to do with Grace's disappearance." The prosecutor's voice grew sharper as he pressed her on the details. "You expect us to believe that this doll just magically appeared under your floorboards, that you had no idea it was there?" He leaned closer, his tone accusatory. "Or is it more likely that you took Grace, hid her away, and kept this doll as some kind of sick trophy?" The words hung in the air like a dagger. Maria's composure faltered for the first time, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of the witness stand. "I didn't do it," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "God knows I didn't." The prosecutor seized on her hesitation, turning to the jury with a triumphant expression. "Ladies and gentlemen, look at her," he said, gesturing toward Maria. "Does this look like the face of an innocent woman? Or does it look like the face of someone who has something to hide?" The trial dragged on for weeks, but the outcome seemed inevitable. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning with their verdict. Guilty. When the judge announced the sentence, death by electric chair, the courtroom erupted in applause. The spectators cheered, reporters rushed to file their stories, and Grace's mother sobbed openly, clutching the doll to her chest. Maria sat silently, her face expressionless, as the reality of her situation sank in. She was to die for a crime she didn't commit, condemned not by evidence, but by fear, prejudice, and a thirst for vengeance. But even as the guards led her away, she held her head high, her faith unbroken. For Maria, the truth was known to God, and she believed that one day it would be known to the world as well. The cell was small, no larger than a pantry, with walls of cold, unyielding stone, and a narrow cot that creaked under the slightest movement. A single barred window, high up on one wall, let in a sliver of light during the day and a faint view of the moon at night. This was Maria's world now, a space that seemed designed to crush both the body and the spirit. Yet, even in this bleak place, Maria found a way to hold on to hope. The days in solitary confinement were long and unchanging, marked only by the arrival of meals slipped through a small slot in the door. The guards rarely spoke to her, their faces blank masks as they carried out their duties. Occasionally, she heard distant voices or the clanging of metal doors echoing through the prison, reminders of the world outside her cell. But for the most part, Maria was alone. In the beginning, the silence was suffocating. Maria had always been surrounded by the hum of life, her siblings' laughter, her mother's soft singing, the clatter of pots and pans in the kitchen. Now, the absence of sound was almost deafening, a void that threatened to consume her. She found herself replaying memories in her mind, clinging to moments of joy and love as a lifeline against the despair creeping into her heart. Maria's faith became her anchor. Every morning, she knelt by the cot and prayed, her whispered words filling the silence with a quiet reverence. She prayed for strength, for clarity, for justice. She prayed for Grace, wherever she might be, and for Grace's family, whose grief she could only imagine. She even prayed for the judge, whose hatred for her burned like a visible flame. "Forgive them, Father," she whispered, "for they do not know what they are doing." The Bible, provided by the prison chaplain, became her constant companion. Its pages were worn and yellowed, the cover scuffed from years of use. But to Maria, it was a treasure. She read it every day, her fingers tracing the words as she sought comfort and wisdom. The stories of suffering and redemption resonated with her deeply. Job's unwavering faith in the face of unimaginable loss, Daniel's courage in the lion's den, Esther's bravery in standing up for her people. These stories reminded Maria that she was not alone, that others had endured great trials and emerged stronger because of their faith. One afternoon, a guard opened her cell door to allow the chaplain inside. He was an older man with kind eyes and a voice that carried a soothing warmth. He sat on the edge of the cot, his Bible resting on his lap, and spoke to Maria about forgiveness and redemption. He offered her the chance to confess, to unburden herself of the weight of her sins. Maria looked at him, her eyes steady and clear. "I have nothing to confess," she said softly. "I am innocent, and God knows my heart." The chaplain studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Faith like yours is rare," he said. "Hold on to it. It will carry you through." As the days turned into weeks, Maria began to notice small acts of kindness that reminded her of the goodness still present in the world. A guard once left an extra slice of bread on her tray, a gesture so unexpected that it brought tears to her eyes. Another guard, a young woman who rarely spoke, placed a small wild flower on the windowsill during her shift. Maria cherished these moments, tucking them away in her heart like precious jewels. At night, when the prison was cloaked in darkness and the air grew cold, Maria would lie on the cot and look up at the sliver of sky visible through the window. The stars seemed impossibly far away, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast expanse of black. Yet they reminded her of the infinite, of the presence of something greater than herself. "You made the heavens and the earth," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Surely you can see the truth." Her solitude also gave her time to reflect on her life, her choices, and the events that had led her to this place. She thought about her family, their laughter, their struggles, their unwavering love for one another. She thought about the moments she had taken for granted, the simple joys she had never fully appreciated until they were gone. And she thought about Grace, the little girl whose disappearance had set this tragedy in motion. Maria had never met her, but in her mind she pictured a bright, lively child with an infectious smile. She prayed that Grace was safe, that the truth would come to light before it was too late. One night, as Maria knelt by the cot in prayer, she heard footsteps approaching her cell. The door creaked open, and she turned to see the young female guard standing there, her face pale and her hands trembling. "I'm not supposed to do this," the guard said in a hushed voice, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "But I believe you. I've seen how you carry yourself, how you never stop praying. A guilty person wouldn't have that kind of peace." Maria's heart swelled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for believing me." The guard nodded, her eyes glistening. "I don't know if it will help, but I'll try to find someone who can look into your case. Someone who isn't blinded by anger." The door closed softly behind her, and Maria was left alone once more. But this time, the darkness felt a little less oppressive. There was a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the bleakest of circumstances, there were those who sought the truth. As the weeks turned into months, Maria's faith only grew stronger. She knew her time was running out, that the day of her execution loomed ever closer. But she refused to give in to despair. She continued to pray, to read her Bible, to find moments of beauty in the smallest details. The way the sunlight filtered through the bars, the sound of a bird singing outside the window. She clung to the belief that God had a plan for her, that her suffering was not in vain. And though the world outside her cell saw her as a condemned woman, Maria knew in her heart that she was free. Free in her faith, free in her spirit, and free in the knowledge that the truth would one day prevail. The night before her scheduled execution, the prison was unusually quiet. Even the faint hum of distant voices and the occasional clank of metal that Maria had grown accustomed to seemed absent, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Maria sat on the edge of her cot, her Bible open in her lap, though her eyes weren't reading the words. Instead, she stared at the window high above, where a pale slice of moonlight spilled into the room, casting long shadows across the floor. Her prayers that night were deeper, more focused, and more desperate than ever before. She poured out her heart to God, her whispered words echoing in the stillness of the cell. She prayed not for herself, but for her family, for Grace, and even for the judge who had condemned her. "Father," she murmured, her voice steady despite the tears running down her cheeks, "give me the strength to face what is to come. Let your will be done through me, and let the truth be revealed in your time." As she prayed, Maria felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, as though an unseen hand were resting gently on her shoulder. Her breathing slowed, and the knot of fear that had been tightening in her chest for days began to loosen. She closed her eyes and pictured the faces of her family, her mother's gentle smile, her siblings' laughter, the love they had always shared despite their struggles. "Watch over them," she whispered. "Help them understand." The sound of approaching footsteps broke her reverie. She turned toward the door as it creaked open, revealing a tall figure standing in the dim light of the corridor. Judge Elijah. He stepped into the cell, his presence filling the small space like a thundercloud. The guard who had accompanied him stayed at the door, watching with a mix of curiosity and unease. Maria remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, as the judge moved closer. He was dressed in a dark suit, his tie neatly knotted, as though he had come straight from a formal event. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were cold and piercing like shards of ice. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension hanging thick in the air. "Maria," he said, at last, his voice low and deliberate. "I thought it only fitting to visit you before your departure." She met his gaze without flinching. "Why are you here?" she asked softly. He smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "I wanted to see for myself how a guilty woman faces her end. Do you feel remorse? Fear? Or are you still clinging to this ridiculous charade of innocence?" Maria's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let him see her falter. "I have nothing to feel remorse for," she said calmly. "I am innocent, and God knows the truth." The judge's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He stepped closer, looming over her. "You've had every opportunity to confess," he said, his voice hardening, "to beg for mercy, but instead you've chosen to defy the court, to mock the very justice system that holds this country together. You have no one to blame but yourself for what will happen tomorrow." Maria took a deep breath, drawing strength from the faith that had sustained her through so much. "The justice system didn't fail me," she said quietly. "It failed Grace, and it failed you." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment Maria thought he might strike her. But he simply straightened, his expression darkening. "You dare to lecture me?" he spat. "You, a convicted murderer, have the audacity to question my integrity?" "I question your heart," Maria said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in his eyes. "You've let anger and grief blind you, but the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply it's buried." The judge laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. "Truth," he sneered. "You speak of truth as though it's some divine force that will swoop in and save you. But let me tell you something, Maria. Truth is what we make it. And tomorrow, the truth will be that you paid the price for your crime." He turned to leave, but Maria's voice stopped him. "Judge Elijah," she called, her tone soft but firm. "Do you believe in God?" He paused, his back to her, his shoulders tense. "I believe in justice," he said without turning around. "Then I'll pray for you," she said simply, "because justice without mercy isn't justice at all." He stood there for a long moment, as though her words had struck a chord he didn't want to acknowledge. Then, without another word, he walked out, the cell door closing heavily behind him. Maria sat back on the cot, her hands trembling slightly. She felt the weight of the judge's hatred pressing down on her, but she also felt a strange sense of clarity. His visit had only strengthened her resolve. She knew now, more than ever, that the truth would come to light, and that her faith was her greatest weapon against the darkness surrounding her. As the hours crept by, Maria continued to pray. She thought about her final moments, about the words she would say when the time came. She didn't know what she would say yet, but she trusted that God would guide her. She lay down on the cot, staring up at the faint glow of the moonlight, and felt a calm wash over her. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would face it with courage and grace. In the early hours of the morning, just before the first light of dawn, Maria fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly at peace. It was as though a voice deep within her had whispered, "Be still. I am with you." The execution room was a stark, sterile space, its coldness amplified by the harsh fluorescent lights that flickered overhead. Rows of chairs faced the glass partition, separating the witnesses from the grim machinery of death. Behind the glass sat the electric chair, a grim relic of justice, its leather straps and crude wiring waiting to fulfill their purpose. The atmosphere was tense, the air heavy with anticipation and morbid curiosity. People murmured in hushed tones, their voices a mix of anger, pity, and unease. Maria stood just outside the room, flanked by 2 guards. She wore a simple prison uniform, her wrists and ankles shackled, the clinking of the chains echoing through the corridor as she walked. Her face was calm, her steps steady, and her gaze unwavering. The guards exchanged nervous glances. It wasn't the demeanor they had expected from someone about to face the electric chair. Maria seemed almost serene, as though she had made peace with her fate. As she entered the room, the murmurs among the spectators grew louder. Some, craned their necks to get a better view, while others leaned forward in their seats, their faces etched with a mix of fascination and disbelief. Among them sat Judge Elijah, his expression cold and unyielding. He was positioned in the front row, his eyes fixed on Maria with an intensity that seemed to pierce through her. To his right, a group of reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, their cameras flashing as they documented every moment. Maria's eyes swept the room, taking in the faces of those who had come to witness her final moments. Some looked at her with open hostility, their lips pressed into thin lines of judgment. Others avoided her gaze, their expressions betraying a flicker of doubt or discomfort. But she didn't linger on any of them. Her focus returned to the chair in the center of the room, the instrument of her execution. It loomed large and imposing, yet Maria felt no fear as she approached it. The guards guided her to the chair and began securing the straps around her wrists, ankles, and chest. The leather was worn and cracked, its texture rough against her skin. Maria sat still, her hands resting lightly on the armrests, her eyes closed as she whispered a silent prayer. The room grew quieter as the guards finished their work, stepping back to allow the executioner to make the final preparations. The warden stepped forward, his voice gruff as he addressed the room. "Maria, you have been convicted of the kidnapping and presumed murder of Grace Elijah. By the power vested in me by the state, I am here to carry out the sentence of death. Before we proceed, do you have any final words?" The room fell silent, the weight of his question hanging in the air. All eyes turned to Maria, the anticipation almost unbearable. Even Judge Elijah leaned forward slightly, his hands clenched tightly on the armrests of his chair. Maria opened her eyes and lifted her head, her gaze steady as she looked out at the crowd. "I do," she said, her voice clear and strong. She paused for a moment, letting the silence deepen, before continuing. "I stand before you today not as a guilty woman, but as someone wrongfully condemned. I did not harm Grace Elijah, and God knows the truth of my heart." Her words sent a ripple through the room. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Maria's voice grew steadier as she went on, her conviction filling the room like a rising tide. "I forgive those who have accused me, and I forgive those who have condemned me. But I will not leave this world without speaking the truth." She turned her gaze directly to Judge Elijah, her eyes locking with his. "You, Judge Elijah, know more than you have admitted. You have allowed your grief to blind you, and in doing so, you have condemned an innocent soul. But God sees all, and the truth will set us free." The judge's face darkened, his jaw tightening as the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. "This is nonsense," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual authority. Maria continued, undeterred. "Grace is alive. She was taken to a place hidden from you, a place known only to those who sought to harm her for their own gain. Search your heart, Judge Elijah. You know this to be true." The room erupted into chaos. Spectators shouted, reporters scrambled to capture her words, and the warden raised his hands in an attempt to restore order. Judge Elijah stood abruptly, his face a mask of fury. "This is a farce," he bellowed. "She's trying to manipulate you, to distract from her guilt." But even as he spoke, a seed of doubt seemed to take root in the minds of those present. The guards hesitated, glancing at the warden for instructions. The executioner's hand hovered over the switch, uncertainty written across his face. "Investigate her claims," a voice called from the back of the room. It was one of the journalists, her notepad clutched tightly in her hand. If she's lying, it will only confirm her guilt. But if she's telling the truth? The warden hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He looked at Maria, then at the judge, whose face had turned a deep shade of red. Finally, he stepped forward and addressed the room. "This execution is suspended until further notice," he declared, his voice firm. "I will not oversee the death of someone who may be innocent." The crowd erupted again, this time with a mix of cheers and protests. Maria sat quietly in the chair, her head bowed in silent prayer. She felt no triumph, only relief. She had spoken her truth, and now it was in God's hands. As the guards began unfastening the straps, Maria looked up and met the warden's gaze. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, his expression grave. "Let's hope the truth is on your side." The revelation of Maria's final words sent shockwaves through the room. As the warden ordered the suspension of the execution, chaos erupted among the crowd. Some shouted in protest, demanding that justice be served without delay, while others murmured in confusion, their confidence in Maria's guilt shaken by her unwavering composure and bold proclamation. Judge Elijah stood frozen, his face a mixture of anger and something more complex. Uncertainty. For a man who had wielded the law as a tool of finality, the suggestion that he had condemned an innocent person struck a nerve he didn't want to acknowledge. He slammed his gavel on the table in front of him, a desperate attempt to restore order. "This is madness," he bellowed, his voice cracking slightly. "We will not allow this farce to derail justice." But the warden, now standing firm in his decision, turned to the judge with a steady gaze. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this is not your call to make. If there's even a chance that what she's saying is true, we owe it to the people and to Grace to investigate." The judge's lips tightened and he sat back down, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The room, still buzzing with murmurs, gradually quieted as the reality of the situation began to settle. The reporters, sensing the weight of the moment, sprang into action, their pens flying across notepads, capturing every detail. Cameras flashed as Maria was led out of the room, her steps measured and deliberate, her face serene. Back in her cell, Maria knelt on the floor and prayed. The events of the execution room had been surreal, but her faith in God's guidance had not wavered. She had spoken the truth, and now she could only hope that it would be enough to save not only herself, but also Grace. Meanwhile, the warden called an emergency meeting with the prison officials and local law enforcement. "We need to act quickly," he said, his voice resolute. "If Maria's claims have any basis, we're dealing with more than just her life. We're talking about the possibility that Grace is still alive." The room fell silent. The idea was almost too much to comprehend. Grace's disappearance had been a source of grief and outrage for months, and the thought that she might still be alive was both hopeful and daunting. After a moment, the warden turned to one of the senior officers. "I want a team on this immediately. Start with Maria's claims, hidden locations, connections to those who might have a motive to harm Grace. Leave no stone unturned." As the investigation began, Judge Elijah returned to his chambers, his mind racing. Maria's words echoed in his head, her piercing gaze and calm demeanor haunting him. Despite his anger and disbelief, a seed of doubt had been planted. He poured himself a drink, the glass trembling slightly in his hand, and sat down at his desk. The files on Grace's case lay in front of him, their edges worn from months of handling. He opened them with a heavy sigh, scanning the pages with a newfound intensity. Hours later, the investigators began to uncover details that pointed to inconsistencies in the case against Maria. The neighbor who had claimed to see her near the woods admitted under pressure that he hadn't been entirely sure it was her. Forensic reanalysis of the doll found in Maria's home revealed fingerprints that did not match hers. The tide of doubt grew stronger, and whispers of conspiracy began to circulate. The turning point came when one of the investigators discovered a lead, a property owned by an associate of Judge Elijah, a remote cabin deep in the woods that had never been searched. The team moved swiftly, their vehicles carving a path through the dense forest. When they reached the cabin, they found signs of recent activity: a makeshift bed, discarded food wrappers, and a child's drawing pinned to the wall. It was a crude but unmistakable depiction of a little girl with golden curls standing beside a butterfly. The discovery sent shockwaves through the team. They searched the surrounding area and found Grace, alive but frightened, hiding in a small crawl space beneath the cabin. She was malnourished and dirty, but otherwise unharmed. When the team carried her out, she clung to the lead investigator, her tear-streaked face buried in his shoulder. Back at the station, the news broke like a thunderclap. Grace's survival and the circumstances of her discovery dominated the headlines. Public opinion, which had been so firmly against Maria, began to shift. Questions arose about how the investigation had been handled and why the evidence had been so damning when the truth had been so far from the surface. For Judge Elijah, the news was a devastating blow. The associate who owned the cabin was arrested and quickly implicated the judge himself, claiming that Elijah had orchestrated the cover-up to protect his reputation and career. The truth unraveled with startling speed, and the once revered judge found himself facing charges of corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to falsely imprison Maria. Maria's release was met with a mix of relief and sorrow. She had lost months of her life to a system that had failed her, but she emerged with the same quiet strength and unwavering faith that had carried her through her ordeal. When she was reunited with Grace, the moment was nothing short of miraculous. The little girl ran into Maria's arms, sobbing as she clung to her, and Maria held her tightly, whispering words of comfort and gratitude. As the truth spread, the town that had once condemned Maria began to rally around her. Apologies poured in from those who had judged her too quickly, and her story became a testament to the power of faith and resilience in the face of injustice. Maria forgave them all, her heart unburdened by resentment. "God has shown me his mercy," she said, "and I will share that mercy with others." In the days that followed, Maria was finally able to return to her family, their reunion marked by tears and laughter. The nightmare was over, and though the scars of her ordeal would remain, they were a reminder of the strength she had found in her darkest moments. The headlines shifted from condemnation to celebration, declaring her a symbol of hope and perseverance. Maria, however, remained humble, attributing her survival and vindication to her faith in God. "He was with me every step of the way," she said, "and he brought the truth to light as only he can." The aftermath of Grace's discovery and Maria's release was a whirlwind of revelations, public outrage, and a relentless pursuit of justice. The immediate reaction from the townspeople was one of shock, followed by a wave of collective guilt. The very same people who had cheered for Maria's execution now struggled to come to terms with their role in her condemnation. They had trusted the narrative presented to them, never questioning the evidence or the motivations of those in power. Now, faced with the truth, they were forced to reckon with their complicity in the injustice that had nearly taken Maria's life. The investigation into Judge Elijah and his associates intensified. It became clear that the entire case against Maria had been carefully orchestrated, a web of lies spun to protect the judge's reputation and hide his own involvement in Grace's disappearance. The associate who had been arrested at the cabin provided damning testimony, revealing that Elijah had known Grace was alive all along. The judge had used his authority to manipulate evidence, intimidate witnesses, and deflect suspicion away from himself. His grief, which had seemed so genuine during Maria's trial, was now exposed as a facade designed to gain public sympathy. The community's trust in its legal system was shattered. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, demanding accountability for the miscarriage of justice. The media descended upon the town, their cameras capturing the anger and betrayal that simmered in the air. Every new detail about the conspiracy added fuel to the fire, and Elijah's once stellar reputation crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. For Maria, the days following her release were a mix of relief and overwhelming emotion. She returned home to her family, their reunion marked by tears and embraces that seemed to stretch on forever. Her mother, who had aged visibly during Maria's imprisonment, held her daughter tightly, refusing to let go. Maria's younger siblings clung to her as though afraid she might disappear again. Their home, once a place of sorrow and fear, was now filled with laughter and gratitude. But the transition was not without its challenges. Maria had spent months in solitary confinement, isolated from the world. The sudden attention from the media and the townspeople was overwhelming. Reporters camped outside her home, eager for a statement, while neighbors stopped by with apologies and offers of support. Maria accepted their words with grace, but she struggled to adjust to her newfound freedom. The trauma of her imprisonment lingered, and she often woke in the middle of the night, her heart racing as though she were still trapped in that cold, dark cell. Despite these challenges, Maria found solace in her faith. She returned to her church, where the congregation welcomed her with open arms. During her first service back, she stood before the crowd and spoke from the heart. "I forgive those who wronged me," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Not because they deserve it, but because God has shown me mercy, and I must do the same. Forgiveness is not a weakness. It is a strength that allows us to heal." Her words resonated deeply with the congregation, many of whom had been among those who judged her harshly during the trial. They wept openly, their guilt and shame giving way to a collective sense of redemption. Maria's story became a source of inspiration, a reminder of the power of resilience and the importance of seeking the truth. Meanwhile, the investigation into Elijah's corruption continued to uncover startling details. Financial records revealed that he had been paying off key figures involved in the case, including the neighbor who had testified against Maria and the officer who claimed to have found Grace's doll in her home. The extent of his deceit was staggering, and the public's outrage grew with each new revelation. When Elijah was finally arrested, the image of him being led out of his grand estate in handcuffs was broadcast nationwide. His face, once a symbol of authority and justice, now reflected the disgrace and humiliation he'd brought upon himself. The trial that followed was a media circus, but unlike Maria's, it was marked by meticulous scrutiny and a demand for accountability. Witness after witness testified against him, painting a picture of a man who'd let his ambition and fear of scandal drive him to unspeakable acts. Grace's testimony was the most heart-wrenching of all. Though still young, she bravely recounted her experience, describing how she had been taken to the cabin and kept hidden by Elijah's associate. Her words brought the courtroom to tears, and her courage further solidified Maria's innocence in the eyes of the public. As Elijah's trial came to a close, he was found guilty on multiple charges, including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and false imprisonment. His sentencing was met with a sense of closure for the community, though the scars of his actions would linger for years to come. For Maria, the journey toward healing was ongoing. She devoted herself to her family, her faith, and her community, using her experience to advocate for others who had been wrongfully accused. She spoke at schools, churches, and community events, sharing her story and emphasizing the importance of compassion, critical thinking, and standing up for what is right. Maria's relationship with Grace became especially meaningful. The bond they formed was unshakable, built on a shared understanding of resilience and the triumph of truth over deceit. Together, they became symbols of hope. Their story a testament to the power of faith and perseverance. In time, the town began to heal. The people who had once condemned Maria worked to rebuild trust and ensure that such an injustice would never happen again. And though the road was long, the lessons learned from Maria's ordeal became a foundation for change. A reminder that the pursuit of truth is a responsibility that belongs to everyone. The unraveling of Judge Elijah's conspiracy sent ripples far beyond the small town where the events had taken place. The discovery of Grace alive and the subsequent investigation had revealed a disturbing network of corruption, deceit, and abuse of power. The arrest and trial of Elijah were only the beginning. His associate, the man who had kept Grace hidden, quickly turned state's witness, providing investigators with a detailed account of the conspiracy. His testimony exposed not only Elijah's involvement, but also implicated several others who had played a role in the cover-up. As investigators delved deeper, they uncovered a history of manipulation and corruption that stretched back years. Elijah had used his position as a judge to silence dissent, protect his allies, and eliminate threats to his reputation and career. The case against him grew stronger with each new piece of evidence, and the once respected judge became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power. The trial of Elijah was a spectacle, drawing national attention. Reporters filled the courtroom every day, their cameras capturing every detail of the proceedings. The prosecution laid out a meticulous case, presenting evidence of falsified records, bribed witnesses, and deliberate suppression of exonerating evidence in Maria's case. The jury listened intently as witness after witness described how Elijah had orchestrated the framing of Maria, using his grief over Grace's disappearance as a shield to deflect suspicion. The testimony of the associate who had kept Grace hidden was particularly damning. He described in chilling detail how Elijah had instructed him to take Grace and keep her out of sight, all to protect a secret that had not yet been fully uncovered. The associate's confession painted Elijah as a man driven by fear and desperation, willing to sacrifice an innocent woman to protect his own interests. Throughout the trial, Elijah maintained his innocence, claiming that he had been manipulated by others and that he had acted out of genuine concern for his daughter. But his attempts to garner sympathy fell flat, especially when Grace herself took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as the little girl, now under the care of a loving family and recovering from her ordeal, bravely recounted her experience. Her testimony was simple but powerful, and it left no doubt in the minds of the jury that Elijah had been complicit in her abduction. As the trial reached its conclusion, the prosecution delivered a closing argument that echoed the sentiments of many who had followed the case. "This is not just about one man's actions," the prosecutor said, addressing the jury. "It's about the betrayal of trust, the abuse of power, and the destruction of innocent lives. We must send a message that no one is above the law and that justice will prevail." The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all charges. When the judge handed down the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, there was a collective sigh of relief in the courtroom. Justice had been served, and a sense of closure began to take hold. For Maria, the verdict marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The public's perception of her had shifted dramatically, and she was no longer seen as the accused, but as a symbol of resilience and the triumph of truth. She received an outpouring of support from people all over the country, many of whom shared their own stories of injustice and thanked her for her courage. Despite the public attention, Maria remained grounded. She focused on rebuilding her life, spending time with her family, and finding solace in her faith. She knew that healing would take time, but she was determined to move forward with grace and strength. She also became an advocate for criminal justice reform, working with organizations dedicated to preventing wrongful convictions and supporting those who had been unjustly imprisoned. Maria's relationship with Grace deepened in the months that followed. The little girl, who had endured so much, found comfort in Maria's presence. They shared a bond that went beyond words, a connection forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. Maria became a mentor and a source of inspiration for Grace, helping her navigate the challenges of healing and rebuilding her sense of safety. As the town grappled with the fallout of Elijah's crimes, it began to undergo a transformation. Community leaders launched initiatives to restore trust and ensure transparency in local government. Training programs were implemented for law enforcement and the judiciary, emphasizing the importance of fairness, accountability, and the presumption of innocence. Schools introduced programs to teach students about the dangers of prejudice and the value of critical thinking. Maria was invited to speak at many of these events, her story serving as a powerful reminder of what could happen when justice was subverted by fear and bias. She approached each opportunity with humility, sharing her experience not to seek sympathy, but to inspire change. "I am not here because I am strong," she would say. "I am here because I had faith, and because there were people who believed in the truth." As the years passed, Maria's life took on a new sense of purpose. She wrote a memoir about her journey, detailing the challenges she had faced and the lessons she had learned. The book became a bestseller, touching the lives of readers around the world. Through her words, she conveyed a message of hope, forgiveness, and the enduring power of faith. The town that had once condemned her began to embrace her as a hero. Streets were renamed, scholarships were established in her honor, and her story was taught in schools as an example of resilience and redemption. Maria, however, remained humble, always attributing her survival to her faith and the support of those who had stood by her. In the end, the truth had not only set Maria free, but had also transformed the lives of countless others. It had exposed the flaws in the system, brought a corrupt man to justice, and reminded everyone of the importance of seeking the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. And for Maria, it reaffirmed her belief in the power of faith, love, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Maria's release and vindication were just the beginning of her journey toward rebuilding her life. Though the truth had come to light and justice had been served, the scars of her ordeal lingered. She carried the weight of months spent in solitary confinement, the accusations hurled at her, and the memories of standing so close to death. But Maria was determined to reclaim her life and find joy and purpose once more. The town that had once turned against her now sought to make amends. Public apologies poured in from all corners. Neighbors who had avoided her family now came bearing gifts and heartfelt apologies. Community leaders invited Maria to speak at events, hoping her story would serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and rushing to judgment. Maria accepted their gestures with grace, though she remained humble and grounded. "Forgiveness is not for the benefit of those who wronged me," she would say when asked how she could forgive the town's betrayal. "It's for my own peace. Carrying anger would only chain me to the past. Forgiveness is how I move forward." Her reunion with her family was a bright spot in an otherwise tumultuous time. Maria's mother, who had spent months praying and advocating for her daughter, held Maria close and wept tears of relief and gratitude. Her younger siblings, who had grown up too quickly in her absence, clung to her, unwilling to let her out of their sight. Their home, once filled with sorrow and uncertainty, now echoed with laughter and warmth as they celebrated Maria's return. One of the most emotional moments came when Maria was reunited with Grace. The little girl, who had been through her own unimaginable ordeal, ran into Maria's arms and held her tightly. Grace's parents, who had once accused Maria of their daughter's disappearance, watched with tears in their eyes as the two embraced. Though their relationship with Maria was complicated, they expressed deep remorse for their role in her suffering. Grace became a regular visitor to Maria's home, and their bond deepened with each passing day. Maria became a mentor and a source of comfort for the young girl, helping her process her trauma and find her voice again. Together, they shared stories, laughter, and quiet moments of reflection, their connection a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Maria's life took on a new sense of purpose as she began to advocate for criminal justice reform. She partnered with organizations that worked to exonerate the wrongfully convicted and improve the fairness of the legal system. She traveled to schools, churches, and community centers, sharing her story and emphasizing the importance of compassion, critical thinking, and the pursuit of truth. Her words resonated deeply, inspiring others to question their assumptions and stand up for justice. In her hometown, Maria became a symbol of hope and resilience. The community honored her by establishing a scholarship fund in her name, dedicated to helping young people pursue careers in law, social justice, and advocacy. Streets and parks were renamed in her honor, and her story was added to the local curriculum as an example of perseverance and the power of faith. Despite the public recognition, Maria remained humble and focused on her mission. She often visited the prison where she had been held, speaking with inmates and sharing messages of hope and redemption. Many of them were deeply moved by her words, and some found the courage to turn their lives around. Maria also found solace in writing. She penned a memoir detailing her journey, from her arrest and trial to her time in solitary confinement and her eventual exoneration. The book became a bestseller, touching the hearts of readers around the world. Through her writing, Maria shared not only her pain, but also her unshakable faith and the lessons she had learned about forgiveness, resilience, and the pursuit of justice. As the years passed, Maria's family flourished. Her siblings excelled in school and pursued their dreams, inspired by their sister's strength and determination. Her mother, once burdened by worry and grief, found peace in seeing her children thrive. The home that had been a place of sorrow became a sanctuary of love and gratitude. Maria herself found new joy in the simple moments, watching the sunrise, sharing meals with her family, and walking through the town that had once been a source of pain, but was now a place of healing and hope. She never stopped giving thanks for the second chance she had been given, attributing her survival and redemption to her faith in God and the support of those who had believed in her innocence. Though the scars of her ordeal would never fully fade, Maria chose to see them as reminders of her strength and resilience. She often said, "My scars are proof that I endured, that I survived, and that I am stronger for it. They remind me that even in our darkest moments there is light if we have faith." In time, Maria's story became a beacon for others facing adversity. People from all walks of life reached out to her, sharing their struggles and finding hope in her journey. Maria welcomed each story with compassion, offering words of encouragement and reminding them that they too could overcome their trials. As her hometown continued to heal and grow, Maria became a beloved figure, not for her fame, but for her kindness, humility, and unwavering commitment to justice. Her life was a testament to the power of forgiveness, the importance of standing up for what is right, and the enduring strength of faith and love. Maria's legacy would live on, not only in the scholarships, parks, and streets named after her, but in the countless lives she touched with her story. She had been to the brink of despair and back, emerging stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to make the world a better place. And though she had every reason to turn her back on the town that had condemned her, she chose instead to embrace it, helping it to heal and grow alongside her. In doing so, Maria proved that even the most profound injustices could be met with grace, compassion, and an unyielding belief in the possibility of redemption. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows on the path Maria walked as she made her way to the small chapel on the outskirts of town. It had become her sanctuary, a place where she could reflect on her journey and give thanks for the blessings that had emerged from her trials. Today, however, felt different. There was a quiet stillness in the air, a sense of renewal that seemed to echo the transformation in her life. Inside the chapel, Maria knelt at the altar, her hands clasped in prayer. Her whispers were barely audible, but her gratitude was evident in the peace that radiated from her expression. She gave thanks for her family, for Grace's safety, and for the strength she had found in the midst of darkness. As she rose, she caught sight of Grace sitting in the front pew, colouring in a small notebook. The sight filled Maria with warmth. Grace had come so far from the frightened, silent child she had first met after her rescue. Now, her laughter filled the air, and her bright eyes sparkled with curiosity and joy. Maria walked over and sat beside her, watching as Grace carefully added colours to her drawing. "What are you making today?" Maria asked softly. Grace held up the notebook, revealing a picture of two figures standing under a tree, their hands joined. One had golden curls, the other dark hair like Maria's. "It's us," Grace said proudly, "because you're my hero." Tears welled in Maria's eyes as she hugged Grace tightly. "No, Grace," she whispered. "You're the hero. You've been so brave." The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day. Grace's parents, overwhelmed by guilt for their role in Maria's ordeal, had encouraged the relationship, recognizing the healing it brought to both of them. Maria had become a second mother figure to Grace, a source of comfort and strength. Together, they had rebuilt their lives, finding joy in the simplest moments. Back at home, Maria's family had flourished. Her younger siblings, inspired by her resilience, excelled in school and pursued their dreams. Her mother, once burdened by sorrow, had regained her strength, finding fulfillment in her work and in the vibrant life their home now held. Every evening, the family gathered around the table, sharing stories and laughter. It was a stark contrast to the quiet, somber meals they had endured during Maria's imprisonment. Maria herself had embraced a new sense of purpose. Her advocacy work had expanded, reaching beyond her hometown to communities across the country. She spoke at conferences, schools, and churches, sharing her story and championing criminal justice reform. Her message was one of hope, resilience, and the power of forgiveness. At one event, a young woman approached Maria after her speech, tears streaming down her face. "Your story saved me," she said, her voice trembling. "I was ready to give up, but hearing how you overcame everything gave me the strength to keep going." Maria took the woman's hands in her own and said, "You have that strength within you. Never forget that. You can overcome anything if you hold on to hope and believe in yourself." Moments like these reaffirmed Maria's belief that her suffering had not been in vain. She had turned her pain into a source of light for others, and she found fulfillment in the lives she touched. Her memoir, which chronicled her journey, had become a bestseller, inspiring readers around the world. Letters poured in from people who had been moved by her story, each one a testament to the impact of her resilience and faith. One day, as Maria stood in the town square, she noticed a group of children playing near a newly erected statue. It was a simple yet powerful piece, depicting a woman with her hands raised in hope, a butterfly resting on her palm. At its base was a plaque that read, "Dedicated to Maria, a symbol of resilience, forgiveness, and the pursuit of truth." Maria approached the statue, her heart full as she read the inscription. The butterfly, a symbol of transformation and renewal, felt fitting. She had emerged from her cocoon of despair, stronger and more determined than ever to make a difference in the world. Despite the public recognition, Maria remained deeply connected to her roots. She continued to attend services at the small chapel, volunteer at local shelters, and mentor young people in her community. She found joy in the quiet moments, planting a garden with her siblings, sharing stories with Grace, and walking through the fields behind her home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maria sat on the porch with her mother, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. Her mother turned to her, a soft smile on her face. "You've been through so much, Maria, but you've turned it into something beautiful. I'm so proud of you." Maria reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "Your strength kept me going." Her mother's eyes glistened with tears, but her smile remained steady. "It was your faith that carried you, Maria, and it's your faith that will continue to guide you." As the stars appeared one by one in the night sky, Maria felt a deep sense of peace. Her life had been marked by unimaginable pain, but it had also been filled with love, growth, and the triumph of truth. She knew that her journey was far from over, but she faced the future with unwavering hope and determination. In the years to come, Maria's legacy would continue to grow. Her story would inspire countless others to stand up against injustice, to forgive even when it seemed impossible, and to believe in the power of faith and resilience. And through it all, Maria would remain the same humble, compassionate woman who had knelt in prayer in a cold prison cell, trusting that the truth would set her free.